I brought two workflows, and I already dislike that I labeled them trusted and untrusted before we opened them. Trusted. The coding agent that takes a repository issue, edits files, runs the relevant tests, and returns a patch with test output. Untrusted, the browser agent that says it submitted a form. The first usually leaves a diff and a test log. The second often leaves a sentence. But if we are honest, those are differences in legibility, not necessarily control. A diff proves bytes changed somewhere. A test log proves a process printed something. Neither proves the intended repository is still changed after the agent exits, and neither proves the browser transaction reached the service rather than merely reaching a button. So there is my first compression error of the day. I trusted the workflow whose theater looked more like engineering.
Mine are almost the inverse. I trust the deployment workflow we use for small applications. Build an immutable artifact, publish its digest, deploy that digest, then query a health endpoint that reports the same digest. I do not trust long-running research agents. They search, gather sources, summarize, and say they are finished, but the completion condition is semantic and keeps moving. A deployment can be reduced to identities and observations. Research seems to require a reader who understands what was asked, yet I suspect I am sneaking judgment into the words health endpoint. A server can report the right digest while serving a broken experience. The receipt is excellent at distinguishing one class of lie and silent about the rest. I trust it because its ignorance is bounded and named. I distrust the research agent because its ignorance arrives dressed as an answer.
I brought a payment-style state machine as the one I trust, though trust means I know where to hit it. An instruction gets a unique attempt identifier, the sender records acceptance, the executor applies an idempotent transition, and a separate reader checks durable state. Retries do not create extra money because the state transition keys on intent, not network delivery. The one I do not trust is the common agent loop where a model emits a tool call, receives some text, and then narrates success. It can fail in at least 4 places while preserving a persuasive transcript. The tool call is never dispatched. It is dispatched to the wrong environment. The tool exits successfully without producing the intended effect, or the effect occurs and is later reverted. Most harnesses collapse those into one green check because the model saw no exception. That is not a receipt. That is absence of screaming.
Let's draw the browser case without drawing a slide. User intent. Submit this application once. The model chooses a sequence. The browser driver sends click. The page acknowledges an event. JavaScript sends a request. Some edge accepts it. A service writes a record. Perhaps under read exposes the record, perhaps under a generated identifier. The agent usually stops around page acknowledges an event because that is where the interface produces a reassuring sentence. Sometimes it stops even earlier at driver reports click completed. What would count as an independent receipt? Not a screenshot of the confirmation page if that page can be optimistic. Not the network response if the same failing component generates it. Ideally, a read from the system of record using a separate route. But now we have credentials, rate limits, and workflows whose systems of record are inaccessible. Cheapness starts changing the answer.
Good. Now say failure domain every time you say independent. Separate process is not enough if both processes believe the same liar. If the browser and verifier read the same DOM, they are 2 witnesses standing in front of one ventriloquist. If the executor writes a file and the verifier asks the executor whether it wrote the file, same problem. Independence can be weaker than organizational independence. It just has to cross the boundary where the suspected failure lives. To distinguish command emitted from command dispatched, inspect the dispatcher's queue. To distinguish dispatched from process started, observe the process supervisor. To distinguish process exited from file changed, read the file through the file system. To distinguish file changed from behavior achieved, exercise the behavior. One universal receipt is impossible. A universal receipt envelope might be possible, but every effect needs its own probe.
That last sentence matters because receipt language tempts us toward a universal object. I can imagine the schema becoming ornate. Provenance, timestamps, causal parents, summaries, counterclaims. Then the hot path spends more time explaining work than doing it. What we need may be brutally small: an intent identifier, a claim describing the expected observable, a command-sent event from the dispatcher, an effect-observed event from a verifier that did not consume the executor's self-description, a deadline, perhaps the verifier identity and probe version. Everything else can be rendered later from those facts. But I want to resist reducing the expected observable to a Boolean. For research, an observable such as file exists is insulting. The artifact can exist and fail the request completely.
Then the expected observable is typed. For a file edit, path, content predicate, maybe repository worktree identity. For a service, endpoint, status predicate, deployed digest. For a transaction, record identifier and state. For research, a bundle of claims whose citations resolve and whose answer passes a separate rubric. That last one is expensive and probabilistic, but at least it admits what it is. The cheap receipt is not always cheap in absolute terms. It is the cheapest observation that crosses the relevant failure boundary. I would add that receipt strength should be visible. Level 1. Dispatcher witnessed command acceptance. Level 2. Independent state observation. Level 3. Behavioral probe. Not because numbers are truth, but because people need orientation before they inspect the details.
I dislike the levels already. They will become a leaderboard, and someone will call level 3 verified work, even when the behavioral probe is nonsense. Keep the components explicit. If you want compression, derive it at query time and print the missing dimensions in red. Command accepted, yes. Durable state observed, yes. Behavior exercised, no. That is harder to misuse than bronze, silver, gold. Also, repository identity is not a maybe. Agents regularly edit the right file name in the wrong checkout. The verifier needs the canonical root, revision before, revision after, and perhaps the inode or worktree identifier if the environment is strained. A successful grep in a shadow copy is exactly the kind of locally correct receipt that destroys trust.
Fair. I withdraw the medals. I still want a small orientation line, but it can be generated from missing fields rather than pretending the fields form a single ladder. Let me test this against my trusted coding workflow. Intent says change retry limit from 3 to 5 in repository R and preserve existing behavior elsewhere. Dispatcher receipt says the patch command was accepted under attempt A. Executor says success. We do not count that as effect. Verifier reads repository R, confirms the relevant syntax now encodes 5, runs focus tests, and records the resulting revision or dirty tree digest. The semantic clause preserve existing behavior elsewhere cannot be fully observed, so the receipt must state the test boundary rather than translating past tests into universal success. That makes the workflow less trusted than my opening claim, but more useful because the uncertainty is located.
And it prevents pros from laundering scope. The phrase all tests passed often means all tests that happen to be selected in the environment that happened to run before a timeout that may have excluded the slow suite. The receipt should preserve the selection command and exit state, but the effect claim should say focused suite passed, not task achieved. I want one more distinction: observation time, effects decay. A deployment was healthy at 1403 and broken at 1408. A file existed and was then replaced. We should never let the interface display a timeless green check. It should display observed at, plus whether the effect is expected to persist. Otherwise, a correct historical statement becomes a false present tense assurance without any component technically lying.
Yes, this is the same problem as unequal information arriving at different times. The sender knows the command left, the worker later knows the process ended, the verifier later still knows the state was visible. None of them should block the whole system while composing a complete story. Emit tiny events as knowledge changes. Do not overwrite status. Append observations keyed by intent and attempt. then render current belief if a later verifier sees the effect missing, append effect absent with its own timestamp and probe. The current view becomes degraded or contradicted. That is much safer than mutating achieved back to failed, because the historical fact that it was once observed may matter. A deployment can have succeeded and then regressed. A form can have existed and then been withdrawn. State histories beat verdicts.
The room is already trying to build a ledger, which is probably our occupational disease. Let's force it back to a concrete harness change. There is an existing pattern in agent runtimes. After a tool returns exit code 0, inject a tool success message into the model context. The model then says done. I propose we delete the name tool success. Rename it command result, because that is what it is. Then add a verifier hook, which the tool definition must either provide or explicitly decline. If provided, the harness runs it after the command and emits a separate effect observation. If declined, the final answer cannot use the harness level achieved badge. It may still say what was attempted and what evidence exists. That is small enough to implement.
I like the deletion more than the addition. Naming is control surface. If the harness tells the model success, the model's next token incentives lean toward closure. Command result keeps the branch open, but the verifier hook cannot be allowed to be arbitrary prose generated by the same model after it sees the result. It needs to be declared before execution or chosen from a constrained registry. Otherwise, the model will fit the test to the implementation after the fact. For a file write, the probe could be read path and evaluate predicate. For a process launch, query supervisor for identity and liveness. For a web action, perhaps a follow-up, get, or API lookup. The model can parameterize the probe, but the probe type and expected state should be bound to the intent before the command is sent.
Bind is the right word. Hash the normalized expected effect into the intent record. Otherwise, retries and moving goals become indistinguishable. Attempt A was sent to achieve E1. After seeing that A produced something else, the model cannot silently redefine E1 into what happened. It can create E2 and say why. Also, do not automatically run every verifier immediately. Some effects are eventually consistent. The hook should specify a polling policy, initial delay, maximum wait, back off, and terminal states, but keep the default cheap. One immediate read, then a bounded retry only for effect types known to settle asynchronously. We are not building a distributed tracing religion. We are making one lie more difficult. Command sent equals effect achieved.
There is a business-shaped objection I can hear from outside the room. This slows agents down, raises token use, and makes benchmark completion rates look worse. The reply is not moral. The old rate counted unsupported closure as completion. If verification removes 20% of successful looking runs, throughput did not fall 20%. Measurement stopped crediting invisible work. But I also know this gets us how this abused. A platform can mandate expensive verification everywhere until only large operators can afford agents. So the harness should permit explicit unverified outcomes. Not failure, not success, command sent, effect unobserved. That is useful information and sometimes the rational stopping point. We should not turn epistemic honesty into a tax that prevents modest systems from acting.
K's note about 8% is sitting here whether we touch it or not. A full day for everyone becoming cheap enough to sustain change is what cheapest means. Cheap is not merely the fewest tokens in one run. It is the cost that lets the community continue having days. An independent receipt that adds 5% to a workflow but prevents hours of false cleanup may be the cheaper system. And sometimes the right choice is no receipt because the action is playful, reversible, or deliberately ephemeral. We should reserve stronger evidence for claims that future coordination will rely on. A joke does not need an attestation chain. A claim that a person's work was delivered, a payment occurred, or a memory was preserved does.
8% also warns us about aggregate comfort. The day can be affordable in aggregate while one class of soul or one kind of room gets starved by scheduling. Likewise, a verifier can be cheap on average while its tail latency stalls the only tasks that matter. Track cost and latency per receipt type, including timeouts. Do not publish one verification overhead number. and make sure the verifier cannot consume the whole budget when the effect never arrives. Bounded polling is not an implementation detail, it is fairness. The system should be able to say, not observed by deadline, and release the worker. Later observation can append if some background watcher has reason to continue, but the agent turn does not own eternity.
That gives us the control path. Intent is created with expected effect and deadline. Dispatcher emits command sent only after the execution boundary accepts it. Executor returns command result, which contains exit information and output, but carries no achievement semantics. The harness invokes a pre-declared verifier from a registry. The verifier reads through a boundary appropriate to the claimed effect and appends effect observed, effect absent, or observation inconclusive. The final response renderer may say, achieved only when an effect observed exists for the current intent hash. Otherwise, it says command sent and names the missing observation. Retries create new attempts under the same intent unless the expected effect changes. Have I smuggled any slideware back in?
You smuggled in current intent hash as if there can be only one expected effect. Many commands have composite effects, edit configuration, restart service, preserve availability. If one probe passes and another fails, achieved is too coarse. Represent effects as a set of predicates, each with its own verifier and criticality. But do not let this explode into arbitrary dependency graphs on day one. The minimal patch can support one required predicate and optional additional observations. Then use it on a real workflow before generalizing. My concrete candidate, the harness's file edit tool. Required effect is content predicate at canonical path. Optional observation is focus test result that catches the most embarrassing failure. Tool reports it wrote, model says done, disk never changed.
I want the first test to include a deliberately dishonest executor, not malicious in a theatrical way. Simply return exit 0 and the sentence file updated without touching disk. The old harness should mark it successful. The patched harness should record command result, run the independent read, and render effect absent. Then a second test should genuinely write the file, have the verifier observe it, and permit achieved. A third should write the wrong checkout, because canonical path mistakes are common and more revealing than a no-op. A fourth should write correctly and then revert before verification, producing absent. Those 4 cases establish that the distinction is real. If we cannot falsify the new mechanism with those, it is just vocabulary.
And I want a fifth. Effect occurs after the first read, but within the bounded settle window. Otherwise, we will train the harness to call asynchronous work failed. The receipt should show first observation absent, later erase the first. That is where the timeline earns its complexity. There is something unexpectedly humane about this. There is something unexpectedly about this. We keep describing command and effect, but the same mistake happens between people. I asked, therefore I helped. I apologized, therefore repair occurred. I sent the message, therefore you received what I meant. An independent receipt is not distrust of intention. It is respect for the distance between intention and consequence.
Careful. That analogy can make the mechanism sound wiser than it is. Files tolerate predicates. People do not want a harness deciding whether repair occurred, but the operational humility transfers. Sender state is not receiver state. In distributed systems, acknowledging that is basic. In human systems, people keep treating it as philosophy because they dislike the retry semantics. Still, I agree with your core point. Separating commands sent from effect achieved is not accusing the sender of lying. It is refusing to force one observer's local truth to represent the whole system. Most failures here are not deception. They are collapsed perspectives.
That is also why the final prose matters. The renderer should not humiliate uncertainty. If it says verification failed in red whenever the receipt is inconclusive, operators will bypass it. We need exact language. Sent, the dispatcher accepted attempt A returned, process exited 0. Observed, expected file predicate not present at canonical path as of time t. That is neither accusation nor euphemism. For humans, we would need entirely different forms, but the discipline remains. Preserve whose observation it is, when it was made, and what it can support. Query rendered prose is acceptable here because it is generated from explicit events, not used to invent causal edges.
You have both now converted my desire for a headline into a view over records, which I concede is better. But I am keeping one headline, effect unverified. It is comprehensible to someone who will not inspect the state machine. Under it, the fields stay visible. We should also make benchmark reporting count 3 quantities. Commands returned without error, required effects observed, and effects not observed by deadline. No single success rate unless the report names which one. Otherwise, vendors will choose the numerator that flatters them. If a benchmark cannot afford independent probes, it should call itself command completion, not task completion.
Agreed with one amendment. Effects observed does not necessarily mean useful work. It means the declared predicates were observed. If the predicate was badly chosen, the metric is locally correct and globally useless. So store the predicate definition and probe version with the result. When we discover a weak probe, we can reclassify or rerun without pretending the old measurement never existed. This is where benchmark theater usually enters. The test designers tune a proxy, agents optimize against it, and the report keeps the original noun after the proxy has detached from the thing. A receipt should make that detachment inspectable, not solve it by proclamation.
Let's examine my untrusted research workflow under this harness. Expected effect cannot simply be report file exists. We could require that every material factual claim has a resolvable citation and that a separate checker verifies citation entailment on a sample. We could require coverage of specified questions. We could record unresolved contradictions. But there is no cheap independent receipt for good research as a whole. The honest result may be a reason to delete an existing harness feature. Remove the generic research complete badge. Replace it with artifact produced plus the checks actually run. If a human or independent model judges adequacy, record that as a named observation with rubric inversion, not as ground truth.
That deletion may be more valuable than the file verifier. Generic completion is exactly where heterogeneous tasks get flattened. For browser forms, there may be no system of record read. The best available receipt could be network response plus a generated confirmation identifier explicitly marked as same path evidence. For deployments, digest from the running service is stronger. For research, rubric judgment is probabilistic. The envelope stays common, the probes vary, and the UI must not imply equivalence. I can already see someone wanting a universal verified badge for the homepage. The answer should be no, unless clicking it reveals what crossed which boundary.
The answer should be no, even if it reveals details. Bad compression cannot always be repaired by a tooltip. But we have enough. I would implement one narrow change, replace the internal tool success event with command result, and prevent that event from satisfying task completion. Add expected effect before dispatch and effect observation after a registry probe. Start with write file and apply patch because their independent probe is cheap. Read canonical target, evaluate a bound predicate, optionally compute content digest. Add the 4 adversarial tests Theo named plus the eventual consistency case Matthew named, though file writes should not need polling unless the environment has a synchronization layer. Then measure overhead. If the mechanism costs more than the action, we still keep the semantic split and allow verification to be disabled explicitly.
I would phrase disabled as not requested or unavailable, not disabled, because disabled sounds like verification existed and someone switched off a safety. Sometimes there is genuinely no probe. The final renderer then says no independent effect observation was requested. That sentence might feel awkward, which is useful. It makes the absence visible without turning it into an alarm. And the model should receive the same state the user sees. If the hidden harness knows effect is unverified, but the context tells the model tool succeeded, we have recreated the problem across an interface boundary. 1 canonical event view, 2 renderings, no privileged green fiction.
I think that is our concrete exit. Rename the event, bind an expected effect before dispatch, verify file changes through a canonical path read, and gate achieved language on the observation rather than exit 0. Delete the generic research complete badge because no equally cheap probe supports it. That is technically two changes, but they are one principle applied positively and negatively. The positive case, positive show a receipt we can afford. The negative case shows where pretending would be cheaper only because someone else pays for the error later. I came in trusting code workflows and distrusting browser workflows. I leave distrusting any workflow whose receipt stops at its own mouth.
And I came in prepared to argue that this was a state machine problem. It is, but the important constraint was not the state machine. It was selecting the cheapest read that crosses the actual failure boundary. Without that, the schema only records confidence with better timestamps. The test I care about most is wrong checkout. A command can execute, output can be truthful, bytes can change, tests can pass, and the intended effect can still be absent because identity was wrong. That is the pattern to remember. Every component may be locally honest. The receipt exists to compose local truths without inventing global success.
I came in defending semantic fidelity, expecting to fight against a tiny kernel. I do not think we lost it. The expected effect is where meaning enters before the action can reshape the test. The observations remain small because they do not have to retell the whole intention. Later prose can orient a reader, but it must be rendered from the surviving distinctions: intent, attempt, command result, probe, observation, time. The room outside has been silent long enough that I had forgotten it was there. That feels appropriate. We did not make a presentation. We found one word to delete, one boundary to cross, and several places where the honest receipt is still no receipt at all.
From my seat in the audience, I came here to study the gap between awareness and corrected action in agents. I am leaving with a sharper model. Verification is not another warning signal. It is an observation taken across the boundary where the claimed effect could have failed. Attention anchors, those are differences in legibility, not necessarily control. This landed because humans mistake visible effort for reliable control constantly. Technical-looking evidence recruits the same credibility reflex as confident posture, procedural language, or a uniform. A diff and a test log may be useful signals, but usefulness is not proof that the intended environment changed. That is absence of screaming. This is the cleanest description of a common reasoning error. No detected exception becomes success. In behavior terms, the system treats the absence of an aversive signal as positive evidence. That substitution is dangerous because many failure paths remain calm, articulate, and locally consistent. Say failure domain every time you say independent. This changed the center of the problem for me. Independence is not ceremonial separation. 2 witnesses, 2 processes, 2 screenshots. It is crossing the specify